Welcome on into the Third Down Analysis podcast. I'm your host, Danny Jackson. Thanks for joining today. So we're going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about 5 questions for BYU after their 5-0 start. And then second, I'm going to talk about how I think BYU could beat Arizona this weekend. So let's jump in here first. We start this episode here, I'd like to recognize it's fall, and as the leaves fall, let's hope that BYU does not fall to Arizona this weekend. There you go, there's the pun for the day. All right, 5 questions about BYU after their 5-0 start. So question 1, should we reset our expectations for BYU season after their 5-0 start? And my answer is no. As fans, we set ourselves up for disappointment when we adjust our expectations mid-season, particularly if we adjust them up. So most of the fans that I'm aware of, and a lot of the analysts that cover BYU and myself, thought that 6 wins would be really great. Had a hard time getting ourselves to figure out how could they get to 6 wins. Well, now BYU's 1 win away from that. They could very well be 6-0 after this Saturday. And even if they lose this Saturday, there still is a really pretty clear, believable path for them to get to 6 wins. So the reason why I don't think you should adjust your expectations upwards is because this season has already been amazing. Let it continue to be amazing. I wouldn't be focused on the national ranking. I wouldn't be focused on if they can get to 9 wins, if they can get to 10 wins. I had Alex Hymas on the podcast here. This episode's going to be coming out probably later, but he said, look, this is one, while it's really important second half of the season for BYU, and they have an opportunity to really capitalize on this. So I think it is very important, but as a fan, enjoy the ride, enjoy the ups. There's going to be some downs, but just enjoy them and take it and run with it. Because if you start thinking, all right, well, man, they could go 10-2, they could go 11-1. What if they go undefeated? Well, then suddenly you're taking the joy out of getting to 7-5 or getting to 8-4 or getting to 9-3. So that's my thought. Now, I think you can hope, which is different than the expectation. I think you can hope. I think you can analyze. I think you can legitimately look and say, yeah, I think there's 7 more wins on this schedule. And that brings me to my second question. How many more games will BYU win this season? I would realistically put the floor at 3 more wins and the ceiling at 5 more wins. Now, right now, I would put 2 losses, 1 at Utah, 1 at UCF. I'm on the fence with those. I think we'll know more about UCF as we get there. But the loss, particularly the loss against Colorado at home, was the one that really surprised me. The loss at Florida, I thought UCF would be more competitive. I was hoping to be more competitive, but nonetheless, I wasn't necessarily expecting them to win that one. But the one against Colorado, I definitely was. So that one really surprised me and makes me think maybe they're a little more vulnerable than I thought. The loss to Utah, it could be a win, it could be a loss, but I'm going to assume it's a loss, in part because of expectations. But I think when I look at the rest of the schedule, I'm thinking difficulty least to greatest. I think that Houston game should be the least difficult. End of the season, they're going to be battered and bruised, just like BYU, but they're still going through the new head coach, and they haven't been great this year. The next difficulty, I'd put Arizona State, Kansas, and Oklahoma State all in one. Oklahoma State originally appeared like they were going to be much better. I'll talk about them in a second, but Arizona State, I still think they're a little bit more paper tiger than what I think they're going to be. Although I don't think BYU is going to walk away from that game. I think it's going to be like a Baylor situation where it's going to be a bit of a battle to walk out of Tempe with a win. But I think BYU can do that. And then Kansas has the talent to win the Big 12, but they haven't put it together this year. And so I don't think they're going to beat BYU now because they're simply not putting it together. Oklahoma State, I think BYU is going to win. I really think they are. The offense for Oklahoma State clearly is not working. Their rushing production is about 50% of what it was last year. And they had 2 receivers last year who nearly got 1,000 yards. Well, this year, their offense isn't clicking the way that it was last year. Alan Bowman has been struggling. And there's something, I don't know what it is. There's something that's not clicking right for them. And last year, the offense covered up the defense. The defense gave up over 400 yards a game last year and allowed the most explosive plays in the Big 12 conference. Oklahoma State also had, of all the teams in the conference last year that had a positive point differential, I think all of them went to a bowl game, except for maybe one. But it was like 9 teams that had a positive point differential. Oklahoma State had the lowest point differential, and they went to the conference title game. So I think last year it shows me that they were really kind of balancing this line between being a mediocre team and being a really good team. And the ball bounced right for them last year to be a really good team. And this year their defense is even worse. They're allowing just under 500 yards a game. And when your offense isn't clicking, you're not stopping anyone. So Friday night at LaVell Edwards Stadium, again, they have the talent to. That's one of those games where everything on paper could look like BYU's gonna run away with it, and then anything can happen on any given Saturday or Friday night. But I would expect BYU to win that one. The next difficult one I think is this Arizona one. We'll go through that in a little bit here. Then that UCF one on the road. Right now, I still have that as the second most difficult game, and then that Utah game. UCF has one of the best rushing attacks, although they struggled against Colorado in part because of turnovers. And then Utah, if Cam Rising's back, I think that it's them in Iowa State as the favorites. But that doesn't mean that BYU can't beat them and can't actually become a favorite. It's more like going with something that's proven right now versus something that's in the process of being proven, which is BYU. So we'll see. Okay, question 3. What's been the most impressive part about the BYU team this year? It's clearly, to me, the defense. Everyone knows that. But let me give you some deep dive on some statistics here that I hope I don't drown you in these. But what these were all telling you is basically this team has improved dramatically over last year. And you've heard it from Jay Hill, guys who understand the system now. And those benefits are paying off. The infusion of some freshmen and a couple of key transfers is helping this team also. I'll speak to that in a minute. Touchdowns allowed. They're tied for 32nd best in the country. They've only allowed 8 touchdowns, and they're second best in the Big 12. So last year, they allowed 39 touchdowns. So 12 games, 39 touchdowns. That's over 3 a game. This year, they're allowing barely 1, maybe 1.5, not even 1.5. Well, about 1.5 a game this year. So that's incredible. I mean, their points per game, they're allowing exactly 2 touchdowns less. 14. They were allowing 29.8 points per game last year. They're allowing 15.8. That's third best in the conference, and it's 28th best in the country. So that right there tells you that they're not. I mean, they're keeping teams out of the end zone. They're giving up a lot. They're giving up field goals instead of touchdowns generally. And I think that's toughness. You actually saw this from them in some games last year. I think about the Texas game. They had a late fourth quarter. It was early fourth quarter defensive stand at like the 2-yard line. 4th down stop. They stopped Texas from getting in to the end zone. So this team has had grit. The defense has had grit. And now they're combining that with experience in a system, so they know what they're doing, and I think they have more confidence out there, and it's really showing. Their yards allowed per game is down overall, so they're doing better there. The next thing I'll hit on, or the last thing I'll hit on, is their defensive pressure rates. So this is the percentage of plays in which they sack or have a QB hurry. So you've probably heard these, but 10 sacks thus far this year, 11 sacks all of last year. But the defensive pressure rate last year was 9%. So 9% of plays they had a hurry or a sack. 9% of passing plays. This year it's almost 18%. So they've nearly doubled that. They already have they had 26 QB hurries last year from the data that I saw. They have 20 this year. So through 5 games, they've almost eclipsed what they did last year, both in sacks and in hurries. And you don't even have to look at those metrics. You just watch the games and say, wow, yeah, we're putting the quarterback down much more often than we were last year. So the last thing about this defense is that they're still rotating in younger guys for experience, and they're still generally maintaining the quality. Now, Baylor, you saw Tommy Prassis and Terry Alexander, they both gave up a touchdown in coverage. And I think those were tough spots for them. But look, they did that in a loss, or in a win. So you know that they're going to learn from that on film. I think Terry and Alexander, actually both of them, they're going to be able to go back to that film and figure out what was it in particular. I think Terry and Alexander, he outran the defender, and I think he didn't properly read the receiver of when receiver's starting to really turn around and get ready to catch the ball. So those are things where it's great that those guys are getting experience in moments where you don't think about the play as much, and they're going to think about it clearly. It's going to come up in film study, but they get to learn while winning. So that's going to continue to pay dividends this year and even into next year. Fourth question, can Jake Retzlaff keep this up? Yes. He's also going to keep the turnovers going, so I would prepare for that. Expect at least 1 turnover a game. But he's getting better because you're seeing him learn to take a sack, learn to throw the ball away. He's done that several times now against Kansas State, against Baylor. Still, obviously, he's having issues at times with accuracy when I think he's accurate, but sometimes he throws the ball so hard, and then other times he's actually quite athletic, and he's such a competitive guy. The first interception against Baylor, he's rolling out to the right, he throws back across his body. That's a play that takes a really strong arm, and it takes an athletic person, and he missed, but those are hard because the receiver sometimes is running at a different speed. They may be running the opposite way. I can't remember that play, if the receiver was running opposite direction of him, but nonetheless, you'd like to see him continue to cut down on those, but he's likely going to keep coming. Now, his completion percentage is up from 50% to 61%. Which is a significant increase. I'd like to see him next year get up to the high 60s. That's going to be really, really positive. But he's shown improvement, and I have to acknowledge that. He's 26th in the country in passing yards, 18th in touchdowns. So, and his receivers keep dropping balls. We saw that we've seen that in almost every game now. And Jake, I think he has a short memory, which may be sometimes why he still makes some of those turnovers. But it's also a benefit because, boy, he doesn't seem to have any fear. He doesn't seem to have fear of throwing a ball into a tight space. And I think that's going to be crucial, particularly for the game against Utah. I think he's going to go in. I don't think he's going to be intimidated by that environment. He's not someone to me who seems intimidated. He seems to have a real strong belief in himself, and yet he's got a passion that clearly shows that it hurts to lose. And bringing in Gary Bohannon, I thought was a really good benefit because he had the resume that if you're Jake, you're thinking, okay, I have to really perform. And you've heard from some of the guys who are covering the team. So they do a great job of covering all the local guys, but they've called out that Jake didn't really win this job until deep into fall camp, and so that I think definitely helped him get better because he knew he's going to have to compete all off season. He's going to have to push himself, and that's an environment that Kalani and A-Rod have helped cultivate, particularly in that QB room, but all across the board. And that leads me to the last question, which is question 5. How did we miss this about BYU? How did we miss the 5-0 start? I don't know anyone who said that. I saw a couple people on Cougar Board who were crazy and said, all right, I think they're going to go 10-2. And honestly, that's like being able to predict a tornado 3 years from now. You can't do it. So those guys, kudos to them, but I mean, that's once in a lifetime. So my thoughts on how we missed this, the biggest thing has got to be development. We've always known this is a developmental program. And for whatever reason, it's probably because we stepped up to the P4 last year, and it just felt like, well, maybe we don't have enough P4 guys across the board. And what we're seeing now is, actually we did have enough P4 guys who could develop into P4, but they needed an off season of playing in the P4, of learning from that, and then getting to go after it for a year in the weight room, in the film room, on the practice field. And we're seeing that show up, particularly in the defensive front. That is where it's Blake Mangelson, John Nelson, Tyler Batty. Those guys, to me, are some of the all-stars of this team, the MVPs, the MIPs, most important people. Because I think everyone thought that they were not. You're bringing back the same guys, and you're concerned. I had that concern. I thought, we're bringing them back. They didn't perform last year. Are they going to perform this year? And they have clearly performed. So it's development, and then Jay Hill and his defensive coaching staff they might be for sure top 3 in the conference. And it's possible at the end of the year, which seems crazy to say, it's possible that they could be the best coaching staff, even better than Utah. I mean, Utah's been good for a long time. Morgan Scalley's been good for a long time. Iowa State, I can't remember their coordinator's name off the top of my head right now, but their defense is the best in the conference. They're allowing 10 points a game. They haven't exactly played the best offensive teams, so we'll see. They've got to play Kansas State. They've got to play Utah when Utah may have Cam Rising. So we'll see how it shakes out for them. But they still, Iowa State's been doing this for a number of years now, though. But I was thinking about this today. I was thinking that what if we recognize at the end of the year that we actually have the best defensive coordinator in the conference? And I say that because Jay Hill's been, even though like Kansas State gave up a ton of yards on the ground, right? But we're still able to rattle them to where they didn't even score a touchdown. And you've seen what they did to Arizona. You've seen what they did to Oklahoma State, and what they're probably going to do with a lot of other teams. Baylor struggled to run the ball. And one of the common themes is that we're hearing coaches say, yeah, they gave us a bunch of looks we weren't expecting. And he's been able to do that week in, week out. I think he's going to be able to continue to do that week in, week out. So I think we underestimated how good Jay Hill really would be in season 2. And I think the third thing, a lot of fans don't like it, but I think A-Rod is doing a really good job. I've always been a fan of his. He has a pretty good balance. He actually has an aggressive play calling style at times where he likes the big play. He likes to set up the big play. He likes to set up chunky yardage. And a lot of people complain about what appears to be conservatism, particularly when BYU gets a lead. But one thing I think he's done a great job this year is he's shifted since LJ got hurt, starting with the Wyoming game. They've been a concertedly more pass-conscious team at the beginning to open up games, where I think it's every game their first play has been a passing play, where that's not typically the case. And I like that. It's a quick hitter. It's a Cody Epps against Baylor, quick out. So it's a quick, simple play, but I like that. I want to keep seeing that, honestly, from them. So, and we didn't know if the freshmen would be able to contribute, and they clearly are contributing enough to give the guys a breather. So, 5 questions for BYU with their 5-0 start. All right, now I want to jump to Arizona, and how can BYU beat the Wildcats? A couple things here in general about my observation about this Arizona team. I've watched a film on, I think all their games, maybe not the New Mexico one, but anyways. And then I watched a good chunk of the Utah, Kansas State games and the Texas Tech games. And they certainly have talent that can scare you at moments, but they're not as consistent as last year, and the metrics bear that out. And Blaine Fowler called this out, I think, correctly early in the season, or in the early, it might have been training camp, but it was preseason. And he said, look, Arizona is joining a new conference. They have to scout a bunch of new teams. I want to say it's 8 teams on their schedule this year that they did not play last year. BYU is one of them. Now, they've played BYU in 2021, but I think now that most of these players are likely not on that same team. The coaching staff's completely different. And the one team, so if you look at the 3 Big 12 teams so far this year, they struggle against Kansas State. That's a new team. It's also on the road, but they struggle against Kansas State. They go on the road to Utah, and they play really well. So maybe it's not home versus road, but Utah's a foe that they know very well. And the defensive coordinator, Dwayne Akinis, he was there at Arizona last year as a safety coach, so he's been around. And so he would have known Utah and what they want to do. And then the next week he played Texas Tech, and you kind of have to start from scratch. Think about if you're doing something in your job and you have to start, like say it's a new analysis that you've got to do. I work in spreadsheets all the time, so I think about this. If you have to set up a new model, or if you have to set up a new data model, or if you have to set up a new process, they've got to do that for every team this year. They don't necessarily have files that they can reference last year. Oh yeah, okay, so these were some of our notes from last year. Sure, they have different teams, or different players. They've got to start from scratch every week. And I think that takes time to adjust to. And so the 2 teams, Kansas State, Texas Tech, new Big 12 teams, they struggle. Utah, familiar foe, they do well. So I'd be curious to see how they do against Colorado and Arizona State. Of course, Arizona State won't be till the end of the year. But, okay, the BYU offense versus the Arizona defense. Arizona's points per game allowed, so they're allowing 3 more points per game this year than they did last year. So it's up from 20 to 23, which, interesting note, across the Big 12, the Big 12 as a conference is allowing 4 points less per game. So they allowed 27 points per game last year. This year they're allowing 23 points per game. I just thought that was interesting. Almost all the teams are allowing fewer points per game. Except for Arizona, they're allowing more points per game. Their total yards allowed per game is up by about 10 yards from last year, and about 30 yards up in the rushing department. So in the passing department, they're doing better, but they're allowing 30 yards. It's almost 150 yards per game. And I think this is where BYU has an opening to say, all right, 150 yards, that's kind of mediocre. And if BYU gets 150 rushing yards, I think that means they're going to win the game, because they have not proven to be a big play rushing team this year. And so if they're getting 150 yards, that either means they've run the ball 80 times, which is not an effective strategy. But if they're rushing 150 yards, that means they're going to have the ball for a chunk of the game. And when A-Rod runs the ball, it's because they're either ahead or it's a tie game, and he's setting up a big play. So I think that there is a real opportunity for BYU, especially with LJ Martin coming back, to get that run game going. I'd love to see LJ get about 75 yards, a second back get another 40, 45, and I'd love to see Jake get 40 to 45 yards, 40 to 50 yards rushing. And as I was going through the metrics, I think where the strengths of this defense are more on the back end, and the weaknesses are more on the front end. So the havoc rate for the defensive backs, which is passes deflected, passes intercepted, it's up 1 percentage point, but the passing yards are down. The passing yards allowed are down year over year. So But the defensive front, their pressure rate. That's what I think was the. There was a couple metrics that were really interesting for me. So their pressure rate, which I can't. Did I? Yeah, I mentioned that with BYU, how they're doing well. BYU's gone from 9% to 18%. Arizona has gone from 18% last year down to 11% this year. So their defensive front is giving up more yards rushing, and they're not getting as much pressure on the quarterbacks. So they have 11 sacks. So that's that thing. That's my point where I don't think this team's as consistent. They had 31 sacks last year, 11 this year. So I guess feasibly, if they get 5 or 6 sacks this game, then they're going to be on pace for last year. But they're not going to get 5 or 6 per game this year, or this game. So they're pacing slower than they were last year, or behind where they were last year. So I think that opens up the opportunity for LJ, and then Jake should have enough time to make plays, to pass the ball. And I want to continue to see BYU pass the ball early in the game and often. And I want to see Darius Laster and Chase Roberts each continue. I want to see them each get a touchdown. Darius has had a touchdown in the last 3 games, Chase in the last 2 games. And if BYU is struggling in the turnover department, then I think that's where this game could really flip negatively for BYU. If I'm thinking about scenarios in which BYU could get themselves into trouble, it's likely a turnover on their side of the field. But if they maintain possession of the ball, then when I look at the metrics, I think they're going to be able to move the ball. Arizona allows about 350 yards a game. Baylor was like 330 something, and BYU got almost 400. So I think BYU is going to be able to move the ball. And it was interesting. I was looking at BYU's average field starting position. They start on average on the 33-yard line, and it was in the top. I want to say it was in the top 20 or top 20 in the country. So I think BYU is going to generate some turnovers, and I think they're going to get some short fields, which leads me to the defense against Arizona's offense. And this is where I think most people feel scared about Arizona, and rightly so, that they have their strengths. And there's a couple of statistics that stand out where you say, wow. First is just simply watching Fafita throw to T-Mac. T-Mac's about on the same pace as last year to get he got 1,400 yards receiving. He's on that same pace this year. And then they have almost 6 yards per carry on the ground. But when you look at the games against Utah and Kansas State, or Kansas State and Texas Tech, those were the 2 losses. They were under 4 yards per carry in those games. And in fact, against Kansas State, they were under 3 yards per carry. So that's where BYU's got to start. I think Hans Olsen called this out well, but that's where BYU's got to initially focus, is say, all right, focus one is they're not going to be able to run the ball. I know it's going to be tempting to say, all right, well, we have to stop Noah Fafita and T-Mac. But I think the first thing they have to do is they actually have to really squelch that run game and do what they did to Baylor and say, no, you're not going to run the ball. What else do you want to do? But no, you're not going to run it. That's not an option. Because then what that situation sets up is now they've got to pass the ball. Against Kansas State, they ran the ball 19 times and they passed over 40 times. And so then you get into a situation where BYU can play cover 8. They can drop 8. They can drop 7 or 8. And Noah Fafita is not a consistent threat to run the ball. I think he's only got 15 or 17 rushing attempts on the season. So this is where they're going to be different. I was thinking about Arizona. They've got that good rushing yards per carry stat that I said. And Kansas State, I think the difference with Kansas State and why they were able to run the ball on BYU is Avery Johnson's always the threat. And so when you've got the QB as the threat, it's another option. So when you've got that RPO, it's a legitimate another option. But that's not the case with Noah Fifita. He hands the ball off. So BYU, it's like Baylor. BYU is going to be able to key in on that run game. It's one less ball carrier that you have to account for on a play, which is easier to run to defend against. And so if BYU limits that rush game, then they're going to be able to have the opportunity to get to T-Mac. Now, New Mexico sacked Fifita 8 times, and then they've only allowed 1 or 2 sacks a game the rest of the season, and so that was bizarre to me. Why New Mexico was able to get to him 8 times, but so I don't think BYU is going to do that, but I could see BYU getting 2 or 3 sacks this game, and I think Jay Hill is going to. I think he's going to dial up pressures at key moments. And when I watch Fifita, he either throws the ball almost immediately or he hangs onto it for a while. And when he hangs onto it, often he goes to T-Mac. He's thrown a third of his completions have gone to T-Mac. And when he's thrown the ball, or what I watch is, okay, he drops back and he holds on to the ball for a while. So, it's either that there's good coverage or he's holding on to the ball, and then he waits, and then he hits T-Mac and they get big chunk plays. That's what happened to BYU against Baylor. I've reflected on that game, and surely there were things that BYU could do to clean up their pass coverage. I recommend you go watch after for the review if you haven't. But what I saw was that Sawyer Robinson would hold on to the ball for a bit because BYU initially had Baylor covered, and then it's hard to sack a guy 18 times, but BYU would apply pressure and often flush Robertson out of the pocket, and then at that point it's hard to defend a guy for 8 seconds, and then you're playing backyard football. He throws the ball to open receiver. So that's my concern, is that Arizona is going to get some big plays out of that. And the thing is, though, that's going to happen. Those plays are going to happen. But the key that BYU's been able to do, they do this against Kansas State, is you get a big play, but limit it from becoming a touchdown. Avery Johnson and DJ Giddens both had big runs against BYU, but Tanner Wall made great plays to prevent both of them from being a touchdown. And so they've got to do the same thing with T-Mac. He's going to catch a couple plays that are going to be 20, 30, 40 yards. Maybe not 40, and you just don't let him get a lot of yards after the catch. And that's where, I've heard BYU's defense got exposed. I was kind of thinking about it. I was thinking, well, yeah, maybe Sawyer Robinson was the best passing quarterback they'd actually faced. Maybe they were exposed. But the more I've thought about it, the more I thought, well, really, they shut down Baylor's run defense, but they still needed to keep a little bit honest to the run and keep a little bit of not a QB spy per se, but they're not going to necessarily just immediately go to drop 8. And Baylor was able to capitalize on a lot of kind of broken plays. So and those are hard to defend. So I wouldn't call it immediately that BYU's pass defense was exposed. It's more that at times they simply couldn't get to Sawyer in time. The last thing about Arizona's offense I was going to say is that Noah Fifita, he's struggling this year more than he did last year. So 61% completion percentage this year versus 72% last year. He's got 6 interceptions already this year versus he had 6 interceptions all of last year. So he's throwing a pick every 30 passes this year, whereas last year was every 55 passes. And he's got almost a 1-to-1 TD to interception ratio, whereas last year it was about a 4-to-1. And so I think BYU is going to get at least 1 pick this game. At least 1 pick. one other thought that I had, or note that I had here, is Noah Fafita. He's thrown a touchdown to 3 different guys, whereas BYU's thrown touchdowns to 8 different guys. So I think that tells you something that, okay, there's going to be a couple of weapons BYU's going to really have to watch out for. On the flip side, I think it's fair to say that BYU's got a number of different weapons that they can go to, which makes it a little bit more challenging to game plan against from a defensive perspective. So if I'm coaching, if I'm Jay Hill this game, I shut down the run. I always have a man on T-Mac. When possible, I have a safety protecting as well for potential double coverage. And then I get creative and not predictable about when I'm going to pressure Noah Fafita, but also I count on the fact that I'm going to be able to at times rush 3, rush 4, and still hurry and sack Noah Fafita. So my prediction for this game is I'm going to put it 35-21 for BYU, and I think it's going to be a fun game. So thanks for listening on in, and let's go Cougars.